So I think there's different levels of impact that full legalization will have on the African American community. One, from a criminal justice space, you'll see less arrest, less stopping, less searching of black and brown people because of cannabis possession. No more, I smell cannabis, let me search your vehicle, none of that stuff. In addition to that, though, there are financial impacts. I think should African Americans get into the cannabis space, and not just from a working perspective as an employee, but from our ownership perspective, we could see a positive financial impact in cannabis. As far as cannabis on a larger scale, with the resources coming in, we estimate, it could be somewhere upwards of $500 million. In my view, there are a lot of ways to invest those dollars right back into black and brown communities.
Well, I think it will be tremendous, primarily because African American and communities of colors have been disproportionately impacted by the failed war on drugs. So, as we've seen across the Commonwealth, across the country, when states have moved to legalize adult use cannabis, we've seen many times in those states a reduction in communities of colors being penalized criminally for it. So we believe the same thing could happen here in Pennsylvania.
And my short answer is I have no earthly idea because ultimately God is in the details. And we could pass an awful bill. We could enact a law that does very little to improve the lives of Black folk who've been disproportionately impacted and intentionally and explicitly targeted in the war on drugs. Or we could pass something that puts all the other states to shame. My hope and my commitment is to the latter, to learn from the mistakes and the leadership of other state legislatures. That is absolutely something I'm committed to. There's not one way to legalize cannabis. I was not in office when medical cannabis was legalized. I am a medical cannabis patient. So from my consumer experience, I see a lot of issues with the current law and that need addressing. So I'm hoping that those things will be addressed with regard to any bills that come up in the next term. But I believe that this is something that we should be committed to. But first and foremost, from an equity-centered position, and as it relates to public health, community safety, and addressing wealth and other forms of inequality, largely based on race. So I have no interest in facilitating rich white men getting richer off of cannabis. That is not an interest of mine. I am deeply disinterested in that approach. I'm also not interested in legalizing cannabis if all it does is to generate tax revenues that go to the general fund to be used by electeds for whatever pet projects they have, and not in furtherance of racial, economic, social justice. So if it's just a means to generate a lot more tax revenue for electeds to play with, not interested.
Well, I think one of the ways that cannabis legalization can help with the police reform is that, one, you'll have less police contact. So, a police officer pulling you over and saying they smell marijuana and therefore searching your vehicle, those days will be over. Police, just patting you down and finding marijuana on you and arresting you for those things, those days would be over. But I think, on a larger scale, just changing the mindset of how people view cannabis in our communities will definitely help with police community interactions.
So legalizing cannabis, we believe, opens up a wonderful possibility, because in bills that are before us, particularly in House Bill 2050, which is my bill, we have criminal justice reform in there for people who have been impacted negatively, have criminal records, or maybe even sitting in our correctional facilities. they will automatically be released. Their records will automatically be expunged. Their licenses, either professional or driving licenses, will be returned. The onus would be on the state to kind of identify those folk, help them through the process. We are putting money aside for the departments to do that. And so we think it would be a wonderful opportunity to kind of reform our criminal justice system, and it opens up our facilities and our law enforcement to focus on more serious related crime.
Um, it does have a particularly interesting potential impact on policing, which of course we're talking quite a lot about, given all the civil unrest and the wonderful mass protests around the Commonwealth and around the world. Um, if we legalize it, we create an opportunity to divest law enforcement from getting in our business. And as long as we are using it as the law provides, then leave us the hell alone. This should not be something that law enforcement should be involved in if we are using it as the law provides. It will be of particular benefit if we divest in all the traffic enforcement that law enforcement agencies um, commit to. If there's a disconnection between law enforcement and traffic enforcement, which I think is something we really should look at, then there are fewer opportunities for police who have personal opinions against cannabis and other drugs to have an intervention to take things to the next level and escalate things and put people in the criminal justice system who have no business being there. So that's something that I think is a potential upside if we do this right.
Well, for me, the war on drugs was nothing but the war on poor people. And cannabis legalization will mean that we as a country have taken a wholesale shift on how we see cannabis, from drug to medicine to something that could be recreationally used. But what we can't allow to happen is we can't allow cannabis legalization to happen without the restorative justice component to it. There has to be a restoration of all of the folks who were negatively impacted by cannabis in our Commonwealth. So that's expunging criminal records. That's quite honestly, I would go as far as saying, full pardons, removing it totally from a person's record. And for me, I would look at how can we provide tax credits, incentives, grants, or whatnot to those who have been negatively impacted by our cannabis laws, so that they can be a part of the business aspect of this growing economy. Should we fully legalize cannabis?
Sure. I think having this conversation is timely, as we're seeing across the world a readjustment to all of the systemic and institutionalized racism and dynamics around the country and in that space. So with having this legalization question around cannabis, I think gives us also a chance to reinvest and reimagine what it means to be equitable in the Commonwealth. And so again, in bills that we've been talking about that's before us, we are looking to put resources into making sure there's access for communities of color to have licenses in the new space, in a new industry. We're looking to put money into building capacity into communities of color for business opportunities or for social opportunities. So we think this is a great moment in time and will be tremendous for really continue the conversation around equity and inclusion.
Um, so as I mentioned on the front end, to me, my focus and my interest is about creating policy around cannabis that is centered on equity, social equity. So that's not just how it impacts Black and brown folk, who were the original boogeymen, which facilitated the long-standing prohibition of cannabis. If you were Mexican American or African American, you were the boogeyman. You were the poster boys for um, um, wacky tobacco, for Mary Jane, for this drug, this plant that white elected officials um, wanted to ban for political reasons and used us as bait. So if it's not equity based, I'm going to have a real problem. And I don't care if Republicans are in power or Democrats are in power. This is a justice issue, and that means that all the people who are locked up in cages related to for drug-related offenses, they should be freed, and their records should be expunged because they're incarcerated for what rich white guys are getting richer off of, and that is deeply problematic. That is unjust, to say the very least. Um, and we have to make sure that there are entrepreneurial opportunities in the cannabis industry for all so that we can begin to address this massive wealth gap between black and white. If it doesn't create significant financial wealth for not just individuals from historically disadvantaged communities, uh, individually and also collectively, then we haven't done our job. Because there are any number of industries that have um, lobbyists who have created a new class of wealthy folk intentionally. And I believe that if there's any area for reparations, it needs to be one that is fueled by the extraordinary growth of legal cannabis. So if there's not a reparations type of um, perspective around this, then I'm gonna have a problem. And I know that's a controversial term, but these are controversial issues, and this is what justice looks like: to not connect the financial opportunities with the communities who are on the front lines, the victims of the war on drugs. Then we've missed a real opportunity, and we should be held accountable for that by the public.
Well, first thing that the public can do is call your legislator and let them know where you stand on the legalization of adult use cannabis. That's one. The second thing is be direct in your request. We need to hear from you that you agree that we should not legalize cannabis unless we're doing it the right way. The right way means legalization. The right way means a home grow. The right way means the restorative justice and fixing criminal records. The right way means making sure that African Americans have an opportunity to not just be workers, but be owners. So that means you might have to, lower what is necessary to get in to owning a dispensary, to owning a grower processing facility. But also, let's look to the future. Let's look at how we're training our young people to work in the cannabis industry. How are we training them in hydroponics? How are we training them in growing? How are we training them in a whole lot of other things that will benefit them in the future with regards to the cannabis industry? Thank you again for having me. I'm State Representative Jordan Harris of the 186th District, House Democratic Whip, and hopefully soon we will legalize cannabis in Pennsylvania.
I think continue to push us to address the issue. Almost, I think the lieutenant governor did a 67 county tour talking about this, where well over 60% of the Commonwealth citizens said that it was time for us to legalize cannabis, adult use cannabis. I think there have been other studies that have come out recently, even in conservative areas, where citizens of Pennsylvania have said the time is now for us to legalize cannabis. I think citizens have to continue to advocate that for themselves. They have to write letters, they have to email us, they have to make calls, they have to do the things that you're doing here, hold conferences, write op-ed pieces. But I think with your help, we will move this assembly. And you heard the governors already have called for us in this budget year to try to figure out a way to legalize adult use. And I think the time is now. I think with your help, your advocacy, and your continued push, we will get this done.
One is use the right language. Don't use your enemy's language, because whatever side of the issue you're on, you use your enemy's language, they win. We also have to make sure that however we talk about it, that we center it on justice, on social equity. Third is that we roll up our sleeves. We listen to what's being talked about in Harrisburg, in City Hall, in Congress about this issue. Train ourselves. We have to be knowledgeable and mobilize around influencing the electeds who are going to be at the table, who decide what these pieces of legislation look like, to make sure that our interests are represented in the bill that will ultimately be enacted into law. So that's my piece. Thanks so much, and I look forward to continuing this discussion.